Today we're doing something a bit different. We're visiting two fascinating church crypt museums. And in the middle, we're going to pop to two interesting and often overlooked churches in central London as we walk between these two. But we're going to start with St. Bride's Church. It's a beautiful church hidden away between the buildings next to Fleet Street. And immediately as you see the spire is very unusual and it's inspired by the name bride. It's like a wedding cake, the tears of a wedding cake. You can see it from the river quite easily as it pokes between the buildings. And sadly, at the moment, it's all a bit covered in scaffolding. But this probably started off as a church dedicated to Saint Bridget in the 6th century and was rebuilt after the Great Fire of London by no other than Sir Christopher Wren in 1672. That got gutted during the war, and 1940 in the London Blitz it was heavily hit. It is a stone's throw from St Paul's. In the 1950s, the interior was reconstructed in neo-Baroque style, as you see today. It's an absolutely gorgeous church. It's got a long association with journalism and newspapers because Fleet Street used to be the home to all the major newspapers. And we will have a little look around the church. But first, we're going to go down into the Free Crypt Museum. There's a series of drawings and photos. Here you can see a fairly modern picture of where St. Bride's is. And then on the wall you have drawings of St. Bride's from 1842, 1753, 1749, the Great Fire in 1666. And down here we're underneath Wren's church. We're in a much older church with some reconstruction to hold it together. And maybe it's not as grand a museum as some of the museums we visit, but it's a fascinating potted history of 2,000 years of London. With here we have the Caxton Ovid, very old manuscript, very beautiful. You can see much more modern brickwork on the left. But now we get into the Anglo-Saxon remains. And these are Anglo-Saxon walls and a variety of grave covers and gravestones from throughout the period. You can see a mishmash of Saxon and Middle Ages with modern brickwork to hold it all together. And we even step over part of the church foundations. There's a step and ramp here so that they don't have to cut through that, but it's still exposed. On the left you can see a coffin. It's a metal coffin. When grave diggers were a common thing, lockable metal coffins were also a thing. So here is an example. It's rotted away a little bit, but this is an ancient, probably 300-year-old coffin made out of iron. And you can see some interesting stonework in the background there. Is that a Templar cross? There's a whole bunch of pieces of stonework from different eras of the church. We're through here to part of the undercroft. There's a lovely little chapel down here. And you can see this chapel is inside part of the ancient church. Although it's a small museum, it's a very interesting look into an ancient and 1,000-year-old church that predates the Norman conquest in parts. As we head back in, don't worry, we're not done quite yet. through here are large portions of the church that were really revealed during the fire in 1940. We are able to now see these earlier pieces of the church. You can see it's not just Wren's church from the 1670s, but there's actually pieces of pottery and stonework dating back far before that. And it's all split into cabinets explaining the different centuries. So it's in time period. Here's the Saxon from the 6th to 9th century. And the church has changed and transmuted over time into different shapes and sizes, keeping the overall footprint. In fact, the name bride may also link to the Bridewell. There was actually Bridewell Palace, which later became a prison, was just to the south of this. But it may also go back to Romani Celtic Brigantia, who were here, or the Irish Brigid, who became Bridget, because this was close to a site where Canute and his followers were settled, and as possible links to the Vikings to the origin of this church as well. There's been 7 different churches here, and the museum does a pretty good job of covering what really aren't visible, the history of the church, which really is buried underneath the church and written on paper and in the stones of the basement, not in the structure you can see from the street, which is still a very beautiful church. But there's a collection of fragments of the church, finds from within St. Bride's Church, good description of the Great Fire of 1666 and its aftermath, wiped out much of the city of London and destroyed a lot of churches. And actually, Christopher Wren was commissioned to build them. And here again, there's a small chapel sort of carved into the stones of the old foundations of the earlier churches. You can see there the end of what would have been the nave, the curving in the foundations. So definitely an earlier structure of a slightly differently shaped church. And upstairs, it really is gorgeous. It's a 1950s reimagining of what the church should have looked like centuries before. Very baroque, white pale walls and this beautiful tan wood. And gorgeous stained glass windows, all made after the Second World War. Here there's an altar to journalists who've been killed, and there's some you might recognise and many of you won't. Where it tells a little bit of the story of these journalists who died whilst mainly abroad. And the link here comes actually to the first printing press in Britain was, I think, 1695 next door. And London was the only place in Britain where you were allowed to run a printing press. So with Fleet Street next door, this site has been linked to journalism and newspapers for hundreds of years. Right through to the 1980s, really, when they all moved out. You can still see a lot of signs in Fleet Street, but even down to this beautiful patterned flooring, the gorgeous little gold reliefs. It's a very beautiful church inside, and they do hold concerts. It's well worth coming to a concert if you get the opportunity. There's fascinating pieces around the church. In terms of the little statues, the 2 beautiful statues of saints, and even the detailing, it's a very beautifully reconstructed church. Not trying to simply replicate what was there before, but not doing what a lot of modern churches have done, which is build something ultra modern like in Coventry or Liverpool. Now, outside of St Bride's, we're on our way over to All Hallows by the Tower. But I wanted to show you this small church. As you head down Queen Victoria Street, on the left is St Nicholas Abbey, which is now mainly the Wren coffee shop, of course reconstructed by Wren. You turn down this little side street, Lambeth Hill, and here is the remains of one of Wren's churches. It's St Mary, Somerset, but it's just the church tower. Before the Great Fire of London, there were 14 churches named after the Virgin Mary, and 6 of them got rebuilt after the fire. Quite where the name of this comes from, St Mary, Somerset, is unknown, but during the Blitz it was obliterated, and all that was left really was the tower. And the tower has been maintained and kept, along with a garden which kind of traces the shape of the nave. So you see the overall form of the original church. Passing St Mary, Somerset, we come to St James Garlic Hive. Very unusually named church, with these statues here relating to the Queen's counting of swans. And this is an old church. It's actually nicknamed Wren's Lantern because, of course, it was built and designed by Sir Christopher Wren. And it's the official church of some of the city livery companies. It's actually the controlling parish now for the next church we're heading to, which I particularly like because it has a very unusual association. That a lot of people think Dick Whittington wasn't real, that it's just a made up story for children. But Dick Whittington actually was a real person. So the story goes that a poor boy thought that the streets of London were paved with gold, came to London, and when he reached London, found that they weren't, didn't make any money, left the city, and on the way out, a cat waved to him and told him to return to London, and he became Lord Mayor of London and was Lord Mayor 4 times. Well, this small church, just slightly further along the road, was his parish church, and it's where he's buried. Yet another of Christopher Wren's churches. This is St Michael Paternoster Royal, severely damaged in the Blitz, restored between 66 and 68. It's actually where Richard Dick Whittington, the fabled Lord Mayor, was buried in 1423. Unfortunately, his body was lost during the Blitz. And even more unfortunately, the church is now closed most of the time. It used to be open at lunchtime, but sadly it seems that it's been combined with Garlic Hive and is only open rarely. But it's a beautiful old church with some interesting detail and obviously a fascinating history, with it linked to Dick Whittington. And all that you really see now is this plaque on the wall. Richard Whittington, 4 times Mayor of London, founded and was buried in this church. But it started off as St Michael of Paternosterkirch, which seems to have a link to paternosters. And paternosters, our Father, were rosaries, and rosaries were made down this road. Hopefully I'll get inside here again one day and I'll add some video of inside. It's an interesting church and there's a few items related to Dick Whittington. But as we head off, we're nearly at All Hallows by the Tower. We've been to a few churches on the way, of this little skip around some church crypt museums. But we're going to stop at one of the oldest monuments in London. as you come to the top of the road from St Michael Paternoster Royal and you turn right onto Cannon Street, cross over and you'll see the London Stone. This is an irregular block of Olithic limestone. It's about 53 by 43 by 30 centimetres, and it's the remnant of a much larger object that stood on the south side of the street, so the other side of the street, for many centuries. Around 1100, it came to be known as the London Stone, although it may have been something from the Roman era. By 1598, Stowe wrote that a property the Church of Canterbury had was near to the London Stone because it was a well-known spot. It's sometimes said it marks the centre of London, but it's said that it mustn't leave London. So when the church, St Swithin's, that was on this site was demolished, a cupola was kept over the stone and the wall was preserved, and the stone has been there ever since. It was removed to the Museum of London while the current building was built, but it has to be kept there to maintain London. And now we've got to All Hallows by the Tower, and that's the Tower of London. It's very near to here. It's an interesting church, and the first church we've seen today which wasn't built by Christopher Wren, actually founded in 675. It's possibly the oldest church in the City of London, but as you look at the structure, it doesn't look like a 1500-year-old church, does it? And that's because although it survived the Great Fire of London, it was so badly damaged in the Blitz that there had to be extensive reconstruction, and it wasn't rededicated until 1957. Why it's called All Hallows, we're not sure. It seems to have been founded as part of Barking Abbey, and it was a church that they ran, and at the dissolution of the monasteries was separated from it, and it was originally called Birkenchurcher. But by the 12th century, it possessed 28 houses and half a church, the abbey, and this was the half of the church they had. But it's usually been called All Hallows since then. And seems like the Anglo-Saxon Abbey of Barking, founded by Erkenwald, along with Chertsey Abbey, before he became Bishop of London in 675, had a fairly substantial church here. It's got close ties to shipping and mariners, as we'll see from the exhibit upstairs here, and also an organisation called TOC-H, which is short for Talbot House, and it's for soldiers' rest and recreation. And the vicar here, for a good 40 years, from 1922 to 1962, founded that organisation. Here's an interesting piece. It's a barrel from a ship, and it's actually from Shackleton's crow's nest, from his ship, the Quest, which Shackleton's probably my favourite of the British polar explorers. That was lovely to see this crow's nest from his ship. And fascinating to see how this barrel was repurposed as a crow's nest. And some interesting chapel here, some interesting models of ships, and there is some explanation of the different ships. This is from the bell is from the British Trent. It commemorates 9 sailors who died in the 1990s from a collision in the North Sea. And you can see a series of interesting ships models hanging between the columns. There's a lot of detail here and some very interesting stained glass. You see the beautiful royal crest there. And the church itself, it actually is better looking on the inside than it looks. Now look how that wall is somewhat older than the construction that you see on the outside, or from pillars we see in the middle. And you can see that there's been a modern reconstruction where that portion of wall, I guess possibly, is still dark from the fire. But a new roof has been put on, and the pillars on the nave have been rebuilt in a suitably consistent style. But you can see the ages of the church, the different portions. A beautiful little church right by the Tower of London. It's about 3 minutes walk from the Tower of London, and as you can see, doesn't get that many visitors. But I came here because I've heard a number of times that All Hallows by the Tower has a lovely little crypt. And I even read it was one of the best small museums in London. So we're going to head down and have a little look and see what we think of the crypt. Popping back here. Down this narrow staircase. We descend below street level. And you can straight away see older stonework here. And here is an arch from a much earlier church. We're about 10 foot underneath the current church. Here you see a selection of interesting pieces, wood cuttings, some carvings, some tomb covers. Beautiful model here of what London looked like back in the day. You can see the city walls, and you can see the wider rivers than those that we see today. The bridge crossing, a lot of the buildings are highlighted. A lot of interesting silver work here. And you have chalices, a series of documents relating to the history of the church. And some interesting books here. Now as we turn, we're straight into stonework from an earlier era. I love the cherub with a skull. Then there's a model of a church in a crypt, or in an attic rather. Reminds me somewhat of our Lord of the Attic in Amsterdam, but much less grand. Round a corner, this wonderful chest. It's a beautiful chest with loads of drawings, sketches and pen and ink of different periods of the life of this church, from the chapel to the 1660s, the Blitz, and this beautiful chest here. Where is it? 1705. You can see him from the top. There's a mechanism on it to lock it. Drawing of London. Look at all those churches. They weren't all rebuilt after the Great Fire of London, but Wren did do his bit to put together as many as possible. Very interesting Celtic cross, and there's some pieces from the Middle Ages, the Roman, the Norman. There's a beautiful chapel at the back here, which sadly is closed off and can't really see too clearly on the film, but is very interesting. And then down this corridor, there are interesting memorials from different periods of the church's history. Different graves, crosses related to the Second World War, and the Welsh Guards. pillars from the old church. And we're through into a small chapel built within the structure of the current church, and pieces of Roman. So old pottery, you could see roof tiles there, carved stonework, more beautiful silverware. It's all very well labelled and clear. I'm not going to show the whole museum because really I'd want to encourage you to go to it. But you could see some fascinating pieces along here. And items detailing the very long and storied history of this church, and fragments of a previous time. This is what the abbey would have looked like. And you can see old medieval tiles alongside a poppy from the famous installation at the tower. And here, pieces, fragments left over from the church destroyed by the Blitz. You can see the ancient medieval door half burnt and charred by the Blitz. This church really was completely gutted, and they've managed to retain some fragments of the church. And interesting, that is basically a hook for hanging the lid on the font, so it could be raised and lowered. Quite often fonts are open, but there was a period when fonts stylistically were sealed and it was raised before a christening. It's very well lit, but gives you a feeling. Look at the different textures on the carving. You can see the different eras that this was built. And here there's a small chapel to the side in these sort of barrel arch. And we're back up into the main church. It's a small museum. I'm not sure the claim that it's one of the best museums in London is valid, but I do think it's an excellent church museum. And I wanted to come here because both of these main churches and St. Michael Paternoster, which sadly is closed at the moment, are fascinating insights into the history of London. And they show a side of London people miss. You can live and work and visit London, but in central London there are dozens of these small parish churches which are all very well maintained and have a long and storied history. And these ones in particular are some of my favourites in central London, which can easily be popped into on a trip around London, but are sadly just overlooked and quite often not visited so much. But I hope you liked our visit to these churches and these church crypt museums, and we'll be back with a more conventional museum trip next week. So do like and subscribe, and make sure you come back next week for more Unbound history.